The phones lit up before dawn in Saskatchewan. Not buyers, cancellations. 3 million tons of canola erased overnight. $1.5 billion gone before sunrise. Railcars loaded, ships waiting in Vancouver. Now useless. Beijing didn't argue. It rerouted. By morning, those same orders had a new flag on them. Australia. The country Ottawa never targeted just became the country China rewarded. Farmers stare at full silos. Brokers stare at dead contracts. Ottawa stares at Washington for relief that isn't coming. Was this about steel tariffs, or a colder verdict on who's replaceable in China's supply chain? The next knock comes at the bank. The chain reaction had been set in motion weeks earlier. In July, Canada's Prime Minister stood at a podium in Ottawa and announced a 25% tariff on steel products with Chinese components. No warning, no transition period. The justification, officials claimed, was protecting domestic industry from overcapacity risks. But in the Trade Ministry's private corridors, the reality was sharper. Washington had just slapped Canada with a 35% tariff on its exports, and Ottawa's sudden pivot against Beijing looked suspiciously like an offering to ease American pressure. The calculation was simple: hit China's steel, win back the U.S. market. The calculation was wrong. Beijing's response was surgical. Within days, Chinese importers, state-linked and private alike, sent identical termination letters to Canadian grain traders. Effective immediately, no more Canadian canola would be accepted. No exceptions. It wasn't just a symbolic snub. It was a $1.5 billion shift in trade flows. The ships waiting to load in Vancouver would remain idle. Containers stacked on prairie rail cars would sit under a summer sun that, for canola, meant mold and spoilage. By the week's end, a new set of contracts was signed in Canberra. China committed to buying up to 3 million tons of Australian canola over the next 4 years. For Australia, it was a comeback few had seen coming. Since 2020, their canola had been shut out of the Chinese market over quarantine disputes and concerns about blackleg disease. Now, those restrictions vanished almost overnight. The irony was hard to ignore. Australia had once been the poster child for aligning with U.S. policy against China, from defense pacts to technology bans. Yet, here it was, welcomed back into Beijing's trade embrace, while Canada, another close U.S. ally, was frozen out. Canada's canola sector was uniquely exposed to this kind of blow. In 2024, over one-third of its exports went to China, fulfilling around 40% of China's total demand. That's not diversification, it's dependence. The oil yield from Canadian canola, at roughly 44.6%, made it one of the most efficient oilseed crops on the market, prized for cooking oil production in Asia. But, efficiency doesn't shield you when the buyer walks away. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, farmers opened warehouse doors to rows of yellowing seed piles. The futures market reacted instantly. Prices plunged 12% in a week. Equipment dealers reported canceled orders for new harvesters. Rural banks quietly started restructuring loans, anticipating defaults. And yet in Ottawa, trade officials spoke in measured tones, insisting they were exploring new markets. That was diplomatic code for scrambling to move product into countries with neither the capacity nor the willingness to absorb millions of tons on short notice. Australia, on the other hand, wasn't sitting on surplus. It was facing one of its smallest harvests in 5 years. Bad weather had cut production to around 5.7 million tons. But Canberra played the long game. In July, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese flew to Beijing, bringing agriculture officials and industry executives. They hammered out phytosanitary protocols, arranged trial shipments, and agreed on a timeline. Within days of returning, Australian traders were booking vessels. The short-term numbers didn't matter. What mattered was securing China's long-term demand before Canada found a way back in. Russia also saw opportunity. A decade ago, it barely produced 500,000 tons of rapeseed annually. By 2021, that figure had jumped to 2.8 million tons. Last year, production hit a record 4.22 million. For 2025, projections put it near 5 million tons, with Siberia emerging as a powerhouse. And unlike Australia, Russia already had momentum. Exports of rapeseed to China had risen nearly threefold year on year. Moscow was building a new grain transit hub near the Sino-Russian border specifically to speed shipments of oilseeds, soybeans, and grains into northern Chinese provinces. For China, this was more than punishing one country. It was about diversifying supply chains in a way that made political loyalty less relevant. If one supplier became unreliable, another could step in with minimal disruption. That principle had been applied before in soybeans, rare earths, and even consumer electronics. Now it was canola's turn. Canada's vulnerability wasn't just agricultural, it was, structural as well. Over 70% of its energy sector and half its manufacturing were under U.S. capital control. 3/4 of its exports went to the American market. This left Ottawa in a position where confronting Washington was politically risky. But, accommodating it could trigger losses elsewhere. In this case, the cost of that accommodation was measured in warehouses of unsold grain and the political fury of farm lobbies. The steel tariffs that started it all weren't even economically decisive. Chinese steel accounted for just 18% of Canada's imports, far less than the U.S. share. But symbolically, the measure aligned Ottawa with Washington's anti-China trade stance. And in trade diplomacy, symbolism is rarely free. Beijing read the signal and answered with one of its own, precisely targeted, economically painful, and geopolitically visible. Let's slow this down for a moment. Because honestly, the most striking part of this story isn't that Canada lost the Chinese market. It's how fast Australia took it. Less than a month separated Canada's tariff announcement from the signing of Australia's canola deal. That's not improvisation. That's, preparation. In Western Australia and South Australia, ports like Albany and Port Lincoln are already optimized for bulk grain exports to Asia. Sailing time to Chinese ports is about 1/3 of Canada's, 7 to 10 days instead of over 30. In commodity trading, that's not just a logistical advantage. It's a financial one, reducing freight costs and the risk of spoilage. When Beijing chose a replacement supplier, proximity mattered as much as politics. Meanwhile, Canada's logistics worked against it. Prairie grain must move by rail to Pacific ports before loading on trans-Pacific vessels. Rail bottlenecks, labor disputes, and weather disruptions can stretch delivery timelines by weeks. In a competitive tender, those delays become part of the price, and in this case, part of the reason the price wasn't even considered. The domestic political fallout in Canada began almost immediately. Farm groups accused the government of sacrificing agricultural interests for steel sector politics. Opposition parties demanded hearings on why alternative buyers hadn't been secured before antagonizing the country's largest agricultural customer. In Parliament, ministers repeated that new markets in Europe and Southeast Asia were being explored. But behind closed doors, trade analysts knew the truth. Europe already had its own oilseed production, and Southeast Asia's demand was fragmented, dominated by palm oil. What's more, the U.S., the market Canada had hoped to appease, made no move to lift its 35% tariffs. In effect, Ottawa had traded a guaranteed high-value market for a mere possibility. That possibility didn't materialize. For China, the strategic benefit went beyond canola. The message to other suppliers was clear. Access to its market comes with conditions, and replacement partners are always available. For Australia, the win was more than agricultural. It was proof that economic disagreements could be set aside quickly when both sides saw mutual benefit. Canberra's earlier trade freezes, wine disputes, and even security tensions were effectively put on pause for the sake of capturing a lucrative opportunity. Russia's gains were quieter, but no less significant. Its expanding agricultural footprint, coupled with infrastructure projects aimed squarely at China-bound exports, positioned it as a hedge against any future Australian or Canadian supply issues. By building capacity now, Moscow was signaling that it could step in whenever Beijing needed additional volumes, or leverage in negotiations with other suppliers. By late autumn, the shift was visible in trade statistics. China's canola imports from Canada were effectively zero. Australian shipments, though still small in absolute terms due to the year's weak harvest, were on track to expand sharply the following season. Russian volumes to China were hitting record highs. For global commodity markets, it was a live demonstration of how quickly trade flows can be rerouted when political decisions intervene. In the Canadian countryside, the personal costs were mounting. Storage facilities filled to capacity meant farmers were paying to keep unsold product under control, all while prices stayed low. Banks began tightening credit for next year's planting. For a crop that had once symbolized Canada's agricultural competitiveness, canola had become a cautionary tale. The larger lesson was about leverage, and who had it. Canada had assumed that aligning with United States trade measures against China would buy relief from American tariffs. Instead, it discovered that in a world of shifting alliances and diversified supply chains, leverage doesn't always come from loyalty. It comes from being irreplaceable. And that's the part of the story that stings the most. Because in the space of a single season, Canada proved it was replaceable, and Australia proved it wasn't. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.